The Carver River Bridge replacement was 3 weeks behind schedule and $250,000 over budget. Foreman Donald Kinney had no patience for waste.
What the hell is that?
Triple pass on the splice plate. Blueprint only calls for double, but the joint needed it.
Needed it? There's nothing wrong with the double spec. You are burning steel and you are burning my deadline.
There's a hairline crack in the plate. A double weld would fail under load.
I don't see a crack. I see a welder who thinks he knows better than the engineers. Pack your tools. You are fired.
Eric Ransom didn't argue. He shut off his torch, wiped his goggles, and began packing his tools with the same precision he used on every joint.
Before I go, you'll want this. It's the inspection report on that crack, signed this morning.
Inspection report? You filed a report on a crack nobody else can see?
Kinney crumpled the note and threw it in the dumpster without reading it. The one piece of paper that might have saved his bridge and his career landed on a pile of waste. Eric Ransom picked up his toolbox and walked toward the access ramp. His back was straight, his pace unhurried, as if he was simply leaving for the day. A dozen hard hats turned as he passed. No one spoke. No one wished him well. They were too afraid of Kinney to even meet his eyes.
That crack will fail. I know it in my bones.
He climbed into his pickup, set the toolbox on the passenger seat, and looked back at the bridge one last time. On his dashboard, a faded photograph of a smiling black man in old-fashioned welder's leathers caught the morning light. Then he turned the key and pulled out of the lot, leaving the Carver River Bridge behind.
All right, show's over. We've got a schedule to keep. Back to work.
The crew hesitated, then slowly picked up their tools. One young welder glanced at the dumpster where the crumpled note lay and felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach.
I hope I am wrong, but I am never wrong about a crack.
Inside the dumpster, the warning lay among coffee cups and bent nails, waiting for a disaster to give it a voice. Eric's apartment was a one-room rental 2 miles from the bridge site, quiet and spare like a monk's cell. He set the toolbox by the door and picked up the photograph from his dashboard, running a thumb over the glass. In his mind, a faded image rose. A river choked with twisted steel, and a young man in welder's leathers standing on the bank, his face a mask of shock and grief.
40 years. Never stopped carrying it.
Another memory, warmer this time. A boy watching his father's hands guide a welding torch, learning that every bead was a promise.
Not again, Dad. I won't let it happen again.
He set the photograph on the scarred kitchen table, next to a stack of inspection reports from a dozen other bridges.
A single crack, ignored. That's how it always starts.
He looked out the window toward the unseen river, and in the darkening sky, he felt the weight of every bridge he had ever secretly reinforced. The photograph stared back at him, the only witness to a promise he'd made in silence 20 years ago, 12 hours after Eric Ransom was fired. The morning sun rose on the parallel bridge, a half-mile downstream.
Gentlemen, my crew finished this bridge a full week early and 11,000 under budget. That's Kinney efficiency.
2 miles away, Eric Ransom hadn't slept. At Wu, Anpea, he climbed into his pickup and drove toward the river. He parked on a bluff that overlooked both bridges, killed the engine, and waited.
They'll put the weight on C7 today. That crack will open.
Down on the parallel span, 3 flatbed trucks loaded with concrete blocks lumbered into position, 120 tons apiece.
All right, let's see what she's made of. Start the test.
Eric gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, watching the first truck inch onto the span.
Don't fail. Not today.
The test commenced with a low groan of steel, and somewhere beneath the paint, a hairline fracture began to spread. The 3 flatbeds settled at maximum weight, 120 tons each. Beneath the paint, The hairline crack in splice plate C-7 tore open another quarter-inch. A young engineer on the span touched the joint, jerked his hand back, and grabbed his radio. His voice cut across the test frequency, sharp with alarm.
Something just let go.
The lead engineer on the span shouted an order to abort the test. Workers began scrambling toward the approaches, waving at the trucks to reverse. But the trucks were too heavy and too slow. The bridge deck began to sway like a ship in a storm, and the groan of steel became a roar. A rivet shot from a beam with a crack like a rifle, and the failed joint began to tear the surrounding steel like paper.
They're not going to make it off.
The groan of tortured steel rolled across the river, loud enough for Eric to hear it a quarter-mile away. Birds lifted from the trees.
Lord, give them time.
And then, with a sound like the world tearing in half, the center span of the parallel bridge dropped out of sight. The middle third of the parallel bridge, twisting free of its piers, plunged into the Carver River. 2 engineers still on the span fell with it, their hard hats spinning into the dust.
They were alive 1 second. Now they're just gone.
A rolling cloud of dust and pulverized concrete surged across the interstate below, swallowing cars and signs. Brake lights flashed blindly in the gray. Eric stumbled out of his truck, walked to the edge of the bluff, and stared at the river. His toolbox sat silent on the passenger seat behind him. In the water, twisted steel jutted from the foam. One of the fallen engineers surfaced, motionless before a current pulled him under.
No, no, no. Get those rescue boats in the water. My bridge, my God.
Sirens tore the morning air from every direction. A news helicopter beat low over the tree line, its camera already broadcasting live.
12 hours. I gave him that note 12 hours ago.
He didn't move for a long time. He couldn't look away. The river carried shards of his warning out of sight. By noon, the official count was 2 dead, 6 injured, and 100 miles of highway shut down. The investigation had already begun. By late afternoon, the National Transportation Safety Board took control of the site. Senior investigator Eleanor Briggs stepped out of a black SUV and surveyed the wreckage with a practiced, unsentimental eye.
Secure every personnel file, every time card, every inspection report. Someone knew something, and I want to know who.
On the mounted television in a diner across town, a news anchor spoke over footage of the collapsed span, the Chiron reading. Bridge tragedy. Possible welding defects.
Welding defects. They're going to blame the wrong men again.
He reached for his coffee, but his hand stopped. There, on the table, lay his father's photograph, a silent accusation.
I could walk into that site right now and tell them exactly what failed. But my note's still in that dumpster.
Back at the site, Briggs's team began the meticulous work of cataloging every fractured joint, photographing every weld, unaware that a crucial piece of evidence was already 40 feet away in a dumpster.
I want every daily report from the foreman's office. If a welder even thought about writing down a concern, I want to see it.
But if I come forward now, without that note, I am just a fired welder with a story.
He paid for his coffee, left the photo on the table for a long moment, then slid it back into his pocket. The only witness to his warning was a piece of trash in a dumpster. Investigator Briggs summoned Donald Kinney to the site trailer at dusk. She sat across a folding table, opened a personnel folder, and didn't waste a second on small talk.
Mr. Kinney, your crew's timesheets show a welder named Eric Ransom clocked out at 9:15 a.m. yesterday. What happened to him?
Ransom. I fired him. The man was burning company steel on a triple pass nobody ordered. He was a problem.
Briggs didn't react. Outside the trailer window, a young crew member loitered nervously, and when she caught his eye, he mouthed a single phrase. He was right.
Funny. That's not what your crew says. I am hearing Ransom was the most meticulous welder on this river, that he never laid a bead without a reason.
Sentimentality doesn't finish a bridge on budget. Ransom was slow, overthought every joint. And I don't tolerate prima donnas on my gangs.
Did Mr. Ransom file any paperwork that morning? An inspection report, a daily log, anything that might mention a structural concern?
Nothing. The man walked off my site with his tools and didn't leave me so much as a note.
I am going to search your office, Mr. Kinney. Every drawer, every bin, every scrap of paper. And God help you if I find something you should have told me about.
She stood and motioned to her team. Outside, the dumpster sat in the corner of the lot, a rusted metal box that had swallowed a man's warning 12 hours before anyone died. Briggs pulled on latex gloves and walked toward the dumpster at the corner of the lot. She lifted the lid and dug past coffee grounds and twisted nails, her hand closing on a crumpled ball. She pulled it out, shook off the grit, and smoothed it against the lid. The note read, "Warning hairline crack found on splice plate C, SAB7, reinforced with triple pass weld. Eric Ransom, Class A, welder number 4821.
Splice plate C-7. That's on the new bridge. Get a structural team out there immediately and find me Eric Ransom. This man may have just prevented a second collapse."
2 agents moved toward Donald Kinney, who was still pacing near the wreckage, his face sheet white. They put him in handcuffs as Briggs watched, her expression as cold as the river water. The crumpled note was slipped into an evidence bag, its grease-stained paper now the most critical document in the investigation. 12 hours after it was written, Eric Ransom's warning had been found, and it was about to change everything. At sunset, a structural team reached splice plate C7 on the new bridge. Eric's triple pass weld glinted under the floodlight. They applied a hydraulic load, 2 times the design limit. The joint groaned, but the weld didn't crack.
It's flawless, no voids, no cracks. This welder knew what he was doing.
In the lab, samples from the collapsed bridge told a grimmer story. Single-pass joints were porous, with slag filling the seams.
These joints have half the required metal. They should never have been signed off.
Under a microscope, the failed welds looked like Swiss cheese. The parallel bridge was doomed before the first truck rolled on. Briggs called her team together. She pinned the evidence bag beside a photo of the intact joint.
Ransom's weld is the only thing holding that new span. Without it, we'd have 2 collapsed bridges.
The lead investigator made a note. Ransom, exonerated. Kinney, gross negligence. Then she looked up and said the words that would echo for weeks, 14 miles away. Eric Ransom still didn't know, but in the pocket of his worn-out jeans, his father's photograph seemed heavier. The next morning, Investigator Briggs stood before a room of cameras and held up the evidence bag with Eric's note.
This warning, written by welder Eric Ransom, was thrown in the trash by his foreman. The parallel bridge failed at the exact joint he'd flagged.
By noon, the chyron on every news channel had flipped. Harrow, welder prevented second disaster.
Hero. I am not a hero. I just did my job.
A knock at his door. A courier handed him a thick legal envelope, a subpoena to testify before the NTSB Board of Inquiry.
They want my story. But my story isn't just about a cracked plate.
At the county courthouse, Donald Kinney was formally charged with 2 counts of negligent homicide and felony evidence tampering. Eric watched the footage on his phone, his father's photo pressed under a coffee mug on the table. A lifetime of silence weighed on him.
If I get on that stand, they'll ask why I really added that 3rd pass, and I don't know if I can tell them.
He pulled the photograph close and whispered, as if his father could hear. The NTSB Board of Inquiry convened in a wood-paneled room. Eric Ransom, in a clean dark shirt and his father's photo folded into his pocket, took the stand. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and began to speak in the same measured tones he used on the girder.
I found a hairline crack on splice plate CT7 during my pre-weld inspection. The spec called for double pass, but that crack would have propagated under full load. I added the third pass as a remedial measure. That's standard procedure for a Class A welder. I filed an inspection report and handed it to Foreman Kinney before I left the site.
The board members nodded, making notes. Then, a senior member leaned forward and asked the question that stilled the room. Mr. Ransom, why were you so certain a hairline crack was there? The inspecting engineer signed off on that plate the day before.
Experience. My whole life's experience.
The investigator's pen stopped. In the silence, Eleanor Briggs studied Eric's face and saw something she hadn't seen before, a scar deeper than any weld she'd examined.
That's as close as I can come. For now.
The board reconvened. Eric's professional testimony was accepted, but his cryptic answer left a question lingering in the air, a question Eleanor Briggs was now determined to answer. The board then called Donald Kinney's former superintendent, who produced emails showing the foreman regularly demanded faster, cheaper welds.
These emails prove a pattern of corner cutting that directly led to the collapse.
By day's end, the board formally cleared Eric Ransom of any wrongdoing and commended his integrity. The chairman nodded at Eric and said, "Mr. Ransom, you are free to go. This board thanks you for your service." After the hearing, Eleanor Briggs pulled Eric aside. "Mr. Ransom, let me buy you a coffee." They settled into a booth at a diner across from the federal building.
That photograph in your pocket, you touched it at least 4 times during your testimony.
Eric slipped the worn frame from his pocket and set it on the table between them.
My father. He was a welder, too. He worked on a bridge that fell.
Briggs saw the pain in his eyes and didn't press further. She just nodded slowly. Eric returned to his cramped apartment and pulled a dusty cardboard box from the back of the closet. Inside, a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1967. The headline read, "Silver Bridge Falls into Ohio River." Beneath it, a letter from the Ironworkers Union, faded but cruel. Joseph Ransom, discharged due to negligence. He could still hear his father's voice, thick with old grief and whiskey. "They blamed me, son. I was just a welder." He pulled out a tarnished union card, the dues stamp from 1966 still visible. How many bridges had his father touched? Then another memory rose. The garage, his father's hand on his, saying, "Every bead is a promise." Eric looked at the map on his wall, marked with every bridge he'd secretly reinforced over 20 silent years. 43 red dots.
Investigator Briggs, it's Eric Ransom. I need to go back on the stand to tell the rest of my story.
She listened as he said only 4 more words. "It's about my father." By morning, the board had reopened the session. Eric Ransom was walking toward the truth he'd hidden his entire life.
Chairman, before I step down, I request permission to make a further statement regarding my earlier testimony.
The chairman, after a glance at Investigator Briggs, nodded slowly.
My father, Joseph Ransom, was a welder on the Silver Bridge. When it fell in 1967, they blamed him for the collapse.
On the evidence screen, a grainy newspaper photo of the twisted Silver Bridge appeared. The room leaned forward.
He was disgraced, discharged, and he lived the rest of his life carrying a shame that wasn't his.
Eric held up a tarnished union card. "Joseph Ransom, Iron Workers Local 44, dues paid through 1966.
Every extra weld I've ever made, every joint I've fortified beyond the blueprint, I did it for him, so no son would lose his father to a bridge again."
The boardroom fell into absolute silence. Across the table, Eleanor Briggs's eyes glistened, and she slowly wiped a tear. The gavel remained untouched. No one wanted to break the spell. For the first time in 57 years, Joseph Ransom's name was spoken in a federal inquiry, not as a scapegoat, but as the reason a bridge still stood. The chairman struck the gavel once, its echo hanging in the silent room.
This board moves to recommend that the record of Joseph Ransom be formally corrected and that his name be cleared of all charges of negligence in the Silver Bridge disaster.
A week later, Donald Kinney was sentenced to 6 years in state prison for negligent homicide. The State Transportation Department revoked the contractor's license the same afternoon, barring Kinney Construction from bidding on public works ever again. The morning after, Eric stood at his father's grave, a folded copy of the board's recommendation in his hand.
Eric, the state board reviewed my recommendation. They want you as lead inspector on all Missouri River bridges. It's your call. But no one knows better than you what happens when a welder's voice is thrown away.
Eric looked at the contract, then at the photograph of his father.
It's not just my name on that badge now, it's his.
He folded the photograph into the contract and held both against his chest for a long moment. Outside the window, the new bridge was visible, waiting.
Dad, I am going to do it your way, the right way.
He signed the contract, adding a single clause in his own handwriting. Inspector reserves the right to perform or specify supplemental welds for safety. The state board approved it without question. The next morning, Eric Ransom walked onto the Carver River Bridge as lead inspector, his father's photograph tucked into the inside pocket of his new vest. The old crew, now under his authority, watched as he knelt to inspect a splice plate, his bare hand grazing the steel as if listening for a heartbeat, months compressed into a blur of girders and cable stays. The bridge rose from the rubble, Eric a constant presence, his welder's hood always close at hand. One night, long after the crew had gone, Eric pulled his hood down and welded an extra pass on a critical joint. The very joint where his father's name would one day hang. He laid the bead with the same care he'd learned in his father's garage 40 years before. The hot metal glowing gold in the darkness.
Every bead is a promise.
When he finished, he stood, lifted his hood, and allowed himself a small private smile. The bridge would hold. By the time the final rivet was set, the Carver River Bridge was the most thoroughly inspected, most overwelded span in the state of Missouri. 6 months after the collapse, under a cloudless October sky, 1,000 people gathered at the east approach of the new Carver River Bridge. The governor cut the ribbon. But the crowd wasn't there for him. They were there for the welder who had refused to let the bridge fall. Beside the ribbon, a bronze plaque was unveiled, its polished face catching the sun. The inscription read, "In memory of Joseph Ransom, welder. His legacy holds this bridge." Eric Ransom, in his lead inspector vest, was introduced by Eleanor Briggs. He walked to the microphone without notes. He reached into his pocket and set a small framed photograph on the bridge railing, the same photo that had ridden on his dashboard for 19 years. The crowd hushed. Even the river seemed to still.
Dad, this is your bridge. Let me say it right.
He leaned into the microphone, and for the first time in his life, Eric Ransom prepared to tell the world the truth behind every weld. He drew a breath, and the words that came would be carved into the history of American bridges.
My father spent his life carrying a blame that wasn't his. He died thinking the world believed he was a poor welder. But my father was the finest welder I ever knew. Everything I am, I learned from his hands. 20 years, I've spent secretly reinforcing joints that were signed off as good enough because good enough wasn't enough. Every weld is a promise that no son will lose his father to a bridge. Not on my watch. This bridge is Joseph Ransom's bridge. It will stand because his spirit guards every bolt and bead. As long as I draw breath, no bridge under my care will fall. I swear it on his memory.
Eric stepped back from the microphone, and for one frozen second, there was only silence. Then the crowd erupted. Hard-hatted workers wiped their cheeks. Eleanor Briggs stood with her hand over her heart, tears tracing lines through her makeup. Eric turned and looked at his father's photograph. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that Joseph Ransom was finally proud. The Carver River Bridge opened to traffic at sunset, its steel gleaming in the gold light, carrying the name of a man finally vindicated. Hours later, long after the speeches and the applause, Eric walked alone to the midpoint of the new bridge. He stopped beside the bronze plaque and ran his thumb over the engraved letters of his father's name. Below, the Carver River flowed dark and quiet, carrying the last light of the day. A single semi-trailer rumbled across the span, its weight testing the bridge for the first time since the rebuild.
That's what I built it for. That one truck.
The bridge held without a sound, every weld and bolt exactly as he'd left them.
Not on my watch, Dad. Not ever.
The sun slipped below the horizon, and the steel around him glowed like embers in August. He didn't move until the first stars appeared. He'd been running for 20 years, and he'd finally reached the other side. The Carver River Bridge stood silent, a monument not to disaster, but to a man who refused to let it happen again. In the years that followed, Eric Ransom continued to walk the spans he'd once secretly fortified, but always a small photograph of his father in old Welder's leathers. The bridge became the standard for every span in the state, over-welded, over-inspected, over-safe. He taught a generation of welders that a blueprint is a minimum, not a promise. Sometimes, late at night, he still laid an extra bead on a joint nobody flagged. The river now reflected a bridge that would not fall. On the bronze plaque, his father's name still gleams, a watchman over every bolt and beam. Eric Ransom retired at 62, but his father's photograph never left his dashboard, and the bridge stands as a monument to those who refuse to let it happen again. For every welder who ever added a pass because it was right, this is your bridge. In a high school gymnasium, Eric Ransom, now gray-haired, showed a group of wide-eyed kids the art of the arc. A 10-year-old boy in the front row stared at the torch with wide, unblinking eyes. Eric knelt to his level and explained that every weld was a promise. After the demo, he opened his toolbox to put away the torch. Inside the lid, clipped next to his Class A certificate, was his father's photograph. The boy pointed at the photo. "Is that your dad?"
Every bead is a promise.
The boy nodded, and in that moment, a new welder was born. Eric struck an arc one last time, and golden sparks rose like a blessing over the gym. The sparks faded, and the light held, a promise kept.